Well, many of you have requested it, so today I'm going to be doing a book review for Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. So in approaching doing a book review for this book, because it is so dense and it's quite a bit more layered than most of the books I reviewed, I decided to break apart the topics I wanted to talk about it in several different pieces. So there will be timestamps down in the description if you want to jump around to different topics as I discuss them. First and foremost, let me put a quick disclaimer at the beginning of this video. This is very much an opinion-based review. If you are looking for deep analysis on the philosophy of objectivism, as well as Ayn Rand herself and her writing, this is not the video for you. This is very much an overview of just my opinion and overall surface level thoughts of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. I've only read one other book by Ayn Rand, and that was The Fountainhead. So these are the only two books I have read by Ayn Rand, and I'm also not a philosopher. Disclaimer. So first and foremost, I personally think it's important to understand what a book is. What is the plot of a book? Because I think so often we get dragged into these famous classic works without really knowing what they are about. So Atlas Shrugged follows this group of individuals as they attempt to be successful in the railroad industry in the 1950s. I believe this book was published in the late 1950s, and it is Ayn Rand's last and considered often to be her magnum opus, her longest work, and often considered to be her best work. It is a plot that revolves around the railroad industry, conflicts that arise between people who have various goals in mind, very much a government versus capitalist mindset. The book follows a small group of individuals. I will get to the characters in a minute, but the one main character I will get to now is Dagny Taggart, and she runs Taggart Railroad. She runs it with her brother Jim, who they inherited it from their father, and throughout the entire book, she is working to make it succeed despite governmental regulations. There is also the idea that all these very talented individuals that work for different railroads, different industries that produce manufacturing for the railroads, such as the copper industry, that people that are talented in those industries are vanishing with no explanation. So you would not think that this was a mystery, but this book is very much a mystery. So let's move over to the characters, aka the capitalists. So the main character I've already mentioned, she is Dagny Taggart. She is very much a person who has very good ideas about how to run her railroad, and it is people coming in and telling her what to do that basically ruins stuff. So she has different ways of upkeeping the railroad. They don't really want to worry about that, and because of that, there are horrible crashes. People die. There is tragedy throughout this book. Then her main love interest, I would say, is Hank Rearden. He runs Rearden metal industry. So he is an iron producer. He owns a factory as well as a mine, I believe, where he produces this very unique kind of iron that is much stronger than the rest of the iron that is on the market in the industry. He is very much like Dagny. Then you have a person that we don't actually meet till near the end of the book, and that is John Galt. And you don't know who he is until much later on, but he is the enemy of Dagny Taggart. He is someone who is causing the disappearance of all these talented workmen and inventors and producers that work in the industry of the railroad. And Dagny is very much out to find and destroy John Galt. That is her goal throughout the story, to find out who he is and then destroy him. And then you have many other background characters. You have Hank Rearden's wife as well as his family. You have Dagny Taggart's her brother Jim, the woman he ends up marrying. You have Francisco Dianconia. And he owns copper mines, I believe. And so his family is also in the trade, but he's considered very much a playboy, despite him and Dagny once being very close when they were much younger, but she believes he betrayed her and just became a very flippant playboy, so she despises him. So you have a lot of drama with a lot of different characters. You also have Stadler, Dr. Robert Stadler, who is very much willing to do anything to betray people, to get in with corrupt officials, to get what he wants. And so you have a wide array of characters. So now let's get to some spoilers. And if you want to skip spoilers, I recommend just going straight to discussion on the philosophy that's in this book. But the biggest spoiler is, of course, John Galt is not the bad guy. He's actually the good guy. He believes and sees the future that government and these regulators that are trying to regulate Dagny Taggart as well as Hank Rearden and all these other more capitalist businessmen, they are the bad guys. And John Galt saw that coming. And he invented this very unique machine of some sort, and I can't remember what it is. But he decided, instead of giving it away to the moochers that basically live off the talent of these small individuals that don't really get the benefit of their inventions. So he creates a utopia for himself that is filled with capitalists, that is far away in these mountains. All these people live on their own talents, live on their own merits. In the end of the book, both Dagny and Hank Rearden go over to join John Galt. The railroad industries collapse because of the corruption within the government, and the very ending of the book has a rather hopeful note where they look out upon the world and say, basically, this is our place to renew it, to start a completely capitalist society based on capitalism. And that's a big part of this book, is capitalism versus more socialist society. There's also quite a lot of sex. Dagny has an affair with 3 of the main characters. She is sleeping with Hank Rearden for most of the book, but she also had an affair when she was younger with Francisco, and then in the end she decides to choose John Galt and she sleeps with him. So, and Hank is fine with this. He's like, obviously John Galt is the dominant man because he is a pure capitalist. That's basically ridiculous. So the way that Ayn Rand presents romance is extremely toxic. It's extremely based on your own wants and needs at that moment and not on commitment. I actually had the same issue with the Fountainhead, which was about an architect, and he also had an affair with a woman, and that was a very toxic relationship as well. So I think Ayn Rand just creates a lot of toxic romantic relationships. But let's get to perhaps my favorite part, and that is the philosophy, as we answer the question, who is John Galt? Which is a question that comes up prominently throughout the book. Now, let's talk about a little bit about the philosophy of Ayn Rand, and I'm definitely not an expert, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. So Ayn Rand was very much individual versus altruism. So she grew up in the Soviet Union, and so she saw very much the extreme of socialism. And so she saw this idea that the government would say, oh, you have to give everything you have to the government, and then we will distribute it to people who need it. Of course, that's not how it actually occurred, but that was like the ideal of how the government perceived and said their government was supposed to be. And so when Ayn Rand came to America and saw capitalism, she very much spurned the idea of socialism and saw capitalism as the ideal. And with capitalism, it is very much about your benefit, of how do you benefit? And that, of course, is the idea of the individual. In America, you see that very much. It's all about how can I benefit from it? I personally think that is also the case in socialism. You see in the Soviet Union how like Stalin and all the leaders were like, how can I benefit from this? Even if people are starving, they're far away from me, it's fine. How can I benefit? So I feel like both extremes are bad. That is my opinion. But Ayn Rand was very much, I can see her reason for going so far the other direction because she saw the worst of the altruism path, and so she decided to go so far towards the individualism path. So with that, of course, you have capitalism versus socialism. And of course, Ayn Rand was very much on the extreme of capitalism, pure capitalism. There's no government control. There's no government regulation. It is all up to the capitalist. Ayn Rand presents Dagny, presents Hank as being able to do no wrong. They are perfect in a sense. And why is that? That is because they're capitalist. And because in her ideal world, capitalism cannot be wrong. Because if it is, she would have to admit that maybe you need some type of ideology, some type of political system that is more in the middle, which is where I personally lean, because I definitely think you do need a certain amount of regulations in order to protect people from the greediness of humanity. Because let's face it, capitalists aren't these individuals that are completely based on logic and rational reason, as Hank Rearden, for example, is presented in this book. They are very much emotional creatures as well. All humans are emotional creatures. And Ayn Rand doesn't seem to understand humanity. And I think that is the lacking part of Atlas Shrugged, is she creates these characters that are very much her philosophy as opposed to real people. If you go way too far towards capitalism, you're going to create the types of factories like you saw in the Victorian era, where there were very few regulations, where you had child workers. You also had people working 12 to 14-hour days for very little pay. And I don't think that's a good thing. However, obviously, the other side, as we saw in Soviet Russia, as you see in more communist China in the 1960s, where, you give everything to the government, you have no individual freedom, everything is owned by the government, and they decide how they want to redistribute it. Obviously, that is very wrong too. You also see it a little bit in America now with the extreme regulation of business. Big business isn't really affected that much because they have all their lawyers. They have people that they can pay to deal with and figure out how to implement all these new regulations. But it's the small businesses that you really see hurt by all these regulations that government is putting in. So I definitely think both extremes are bad. And Ayn Rand came from one extreme, the Soviet Union, and she went to the opposite extreme. So I definitely don't agree with her philosophy, as you might have guessed. But I think there's a lot of merit in understanding that philosophy, of finding a balance in the more altruism philosophy versus the more individual philosophy. So my last section of this video will be asking and answering, trying to answer the question, is Atlas Shrugged worth reading? It is 1,200 pages. It is about 63-hour audiobook, which is the longest audiobook I have ever listened to. So the reality is, no, I don't think for the majority of the population, this book is worth reading. Ayn Rand has a lot of other works. Anthem is an example that I've heard recommended to me that is much shorter. It is more of a short story or a novella, and she has quite a few that are shorter that examine the same philosophy that is contained in Atlas Shrugged. So I don't think for the majority of the population, they would ever want to read Atlas Shrugged because it is such a challenging and long book to read, and especially most people, I would think, aren't going to fully ascribe to her philosophy. They may pick apart pieces like I did and agree with parts of what she's saying, but realize that she's going a little bit too far. But I don't think your average reader, your average person is going to pick this up, read it, and absolutely love it because there's not enough interesting, in-depth characters. There's not a very complex world. It's all about the philosophy and Ayn Rand's philosophy. And if you don't 100% subscribe to it, a lot of you will feel like you've wasted your time reading it, especially when Ayn Rand does have shorter works that are probably just as good. Saying that, I do think if you really get into philosophy, if you enjoy mammoth books like I do, I shouldn't, judge myself because Ayn Rand, as well as Atlas Shrugged, has been on my TBR for years. So this is obviously a book that I wanted to read. If you are in that position where you don't mind reading very long books, where you have a lot of time and you go through books quickly, where you enjoy philosophy, even if you don't necessarily agree with it. I want to read Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, but you know what? I really doubt I will agree with about 90%. I will probably disagree with it a lot more than I did Atlas Shrugged. However, I still want to read it. If you are in that position, if you are that type of reader, I can recommend this book to you because it is interesting. It is fascinating. I was never bored. I always wanted to see where the story would go. And most of that came down to the mystery itself, I think. So I'm curious to know, have you read this book? What are your thoughts about Ayn Rand, as well as some of these philosophies that I discussed in this video? Would you be willing to read this book despite its length, despite understanding kind of what it is about? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a great day. Bye.